May 1940. Hitler unleashes the Blitzkrieg on Western Europe, sweeping aside the defences of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France with brutal efficiency. In barely 6 weeks, the unthinkable has happened. Hitler's armies are marching down the Champs-Élysées. The defeated French government is faced with an impossible decision. Should they accept their fate and cooperate with the Nazi invaders? In the chaos, the aging First World War hero, Marshall Philippe Petain, takes the reins of power. In an infamous radio address, Petain makes his position clear. I enter today down the road of collaboration. This is my policy. My ministers are responsible to me. It is I alone who will be judged by history. Petain would indeed be judged, but he would be far from alone. The horror that was World War II was unprecedented in human history. Tens of millions died on the battlefield, and in appalling atrocities. But out of the chaos and suffering, the victorious Allies sought justice for those who had been wronged, in the hope of preventing such crimes from ever being committed again. In pursuing the guilty and exposing the truth, who would be held to account? And who would escape justice? Compromised by politics and the desire for revenge, the pursuit of justice was imperfect. Yet these trials redefined international law and shaped the modern world. This is World War II history on trial.
The shadow of the conquering German armies covered Western Europe. The self-styled master race was riding high. The fall of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France had given him more than 100 million slaves to work for him or starve.
Following the fall of France, Germany had either annexed, occupied, or was allied to much of Europe. Under this cloud of oppression, some would resist the oppressors, but most turned a blind eye, keeping their heads down in the hopes of simply surviving. And then there were those who had welcomed the invaders with open arms, seeing opportunity in the chaos to push their own agendas.
The peculiarity of collaboration during the Second World War was its ideological character. It was really the European New Order, it was European fascists.
There were fascist movements in most countries in Europe, but each fascism was slightly different from the other because naturally each fascism sort of grew up from its own roots.
It was from these national fascist groups that the most ardent collaborators came. But each nation defined collaboration differently.
Collaboration has a principle of you are collaborating with a foreign state, and that is a form of betrayal. How does one define collaboration? That, of course, very much depends on the political situation of each country. If we look at the different countries of Western Europe, the situation is also quite contrasting.
Following the invasion of the Netherlands, the Dutch government and Queen Wilhelmina fled to the UK, establishing a government in exile. The Nazis installed Anton Mussert as a figurehead, but he had no real power. The SS, led by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, ran the country. They, in turn, supervised the Dutch civil service.
In the case of the Netherlands, very clear-cut. If you're a Dutch civil servant, you know that your legitimate government and head of state is in London, and that the German occupier is fully illegitimate.
Belgium was a slightly more complicated proposition.
In the case of Belgium, the government leaves the country, but the king decides to stay and capitulates.
The Germans established a military occupation in Belgium and placed King Leopold III under house arrest. Taking the king's decision to stay as a sign of his desire to collaborate, the Belgian government in exile, led by Prime Minister Hubert Pierlot, denounced Leopold as a traitor.
Where does your loyalty go? With the king or with the government?
Both the Netherlands and Belgium had no shortage of collaborators. Without their help, the Nazis could never have managed their occupations, rooted out resistance networks, or enacted their genocidal racial policies. But the scale and scope of collaboration in these nations was proportionally much smaller than others.
In the case of Austria, talking about collaboration is kind of problematic.
Austria had been annexed and fully integrated into the Third Reich following the Anschluss of 1938. As much as 10% of the adult population was a member of the Nazi Party. 1.3 million Austrians served in the German army, and large numbers of Austrians served in the SS and as concentration camp administrators.
Whatever Austrians were doing during the Second World War, well, they did this as citizens of the Reich. And so for Austria, of course, the post-war discourse became, we are the first victims of Nazi Germany. We are the first to have been occupied. Austria has never been occupied by a foreign army.
Each nation's experience of occupation shaped how collaboration, in the case of Austria, complicity, was understood, and who was seen as guilty. To complicate matters, collaborators took many forms, from bureaucrats and police officers to factory owners and artists, the willing and coerced.
Certainly up to 1942, there were quite a lot of people who were simply conformist, or they collaborated, if you like, in quite small ways, perhaps giving a German soldier a meal or something like that. You had a whole range, a whole spectrum of behavior, right up to people who informed the Gestapo of the whereabouts of Jews or refugees.
The people who denunciated, Jews in hiding, resistors, caused the death of people without, after all, taking any personal risk. They were not the henchmen themselves, but without their action, tens of thousands of our fellow citizens would not have been arrested, tortured, sent to concentration camps and killed.
Although those who denounced or willingly collaborated were conspicuous traitors, the line between victimhood and complicity was often difficult to identify. Under the fog of war, what looked like betrayal from afar could, up close, be an act of desperation.
We shouldn't hold people from the Second World War to the same standards that we hold today in terms of choices. They needed to get through the day, feed their children, get to work, try and make some money. Any kind of opposition would often lead to retribution by the regime, deportation, execution, torture, and all these kind of things. So we need to put that context on the table when we're understanding the choices or non-choices facing people during the occupation of the Second World War.
One of the starkest examples of the ways in which ordinary civilians were forced into collaboration with the Nazis is that of the Kapo. Kapo was the name given to imprisoned Jews who were kept alive but forced by the Nazis to manage their fellow prisoners in concentration camps.
They, of course, get important benefits. Better food, something different housing, etc. So the capos become a very hated figure in the concentration camp system because they used to be one of us, and now they somehow pass on to the other side.
Some capos used their relative authority to secretly help other prisoners. Others were cruel, abusive, and murdered fellow inmates.
Now, this person, whatever you think about them, if they don't do it, they're dead. So could they use that position to make things slightly better? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't.
And this is, of course, at the very heart of the moral ambiguity of the capo. The capo has an awful lot of power, which he can use to punish, to beat, sometimes to kill, but also to protect.
After liberation, some capos faced retribution from fellow survivors and partisans, echoing a broader wave of vengeance against perceived collaborators that swept across Europe in the wake of liberating armies in 1944.
You get a sort of spontaneous upsurge of anger, violence. It's a very muddled moment because you've got people who've done genuinely terrible things, but you're also getting, let's call it, score settling.
Might be the partisans, the resistance, taking their own revenge, retribution on people they see as fascist collaborators, so taking them out and shooting them. There might be a summary trial, but they're never found innocent.
All across Europe, amidst this frenzy of post-war retaliation, authorities were forced to move quickly to restore order.
So there was an urgency to show that formal justice was immediate and severe to cut short any initiatives for popular vengeance. The first trials take place a matter of weeks after the liberation because of this urgency. And so we could see that it's quite astounding in a way, the sheer logistical capacity to organize so many trials in such a short time span.
And the scale of these trials reflects the fact that collaborators represented a threat to the political stability of the nation.
Would they be allowed to continue to participate in political life, to take part in the elections, and maybe be represented in parliament? We needed to purge the electorate before we could organize new elections.
The purge of collaborators took many forms: criminal trials, lustration measures, and denaturalization proceedings.
It was a huge logistical challenge. Never before did the justice system have to bring to trial tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of citizens in a couple of weeks.
As many as 46,000 alleged collaborators were investigated in Denmark, 92,000 in Norway, 120,000 in the Netherlands, and 405,000 in Belgium. Yet in most cases, only a tiny portion of these would make it to trial.
In the case of Belgium, 60,000 court cases are organized, 53,000 people are sentenced for their collaboration. The most important form of collaboration is military collaboration. 32,000 Belgians have been sentenced for carrying arms against their fatherland in German uniform. There was no draft, nobody was forced to fight in German uniform against the Soviet Union, but 32,000 volunteers accomplished military functions.
The Belgian state was able to draw on existing law in its prosecution of these volunteers. Taking up arms in the cause of a foreign aggressor was a clear case of treason. But across Europe, the charge of treason was often hard to prove. While many escaped prosecution, some traitors were singled out in order to send a message.
From Berlin, from Rome, from Tokyo, the campaign started. Propaganda to confuse, divide, soften up their intended victim.
During the war, radio was the main source of entertainment and information for the masses.
Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history. All roads in France are choked with slow-moving masses of refugees.
Radio was a terribly important means of communication. It was to people then what the internet and all our communications really mean today.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
It was very common to have whole families or whole groups of people sitting around the radio listening.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany.
All sides wielded the radio as a weapon, broadcasting propaganda internationally to demoralize, coerce, and undermine their enemies' war efforts. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, in a speech in 1933, said, "Napoleon spoke of the press as the seventh great power. One can apply Napoleon's phrase to our age, speaking of the radio as the eighth great power."
Goebbels was a master of propaganda, and the Germans were very clever at radio engineering. It was a sort of little mini empire in Berlin, the sort of broadcasting house set up, and it was very cleverly managed.
By 1940, the Reich Broadcasting Corporation's foreign language service employed roughly 500 staff, broadcasting Nazi propaganda in 53 languages and transmitting roughly 147 hours of foreign language programming a day. And Goebbels' most prominent English language program was Germany Calling.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
The program was wildly popular in Britain. At its peak, some 6 million regular and 18 million occasional listeners tuned in to listen to the broadcast. Before long, the host was a household name.
William Joyce, who became notorious as Lord Haw-Haw because allegedly having this haw-haw, get out of my way voice on the radio, and they imagined him as a rather posh Englishman with a top hat and a monocle.
Prior to the war, Joyce had been a member of the British Union of Fascists led by Sir Oswald Mosley. Once war was all but certain, many members of the BUF, including Mosley, were interred for fear they would present a wartime risk. Yet Joyce escaped capture, fled Britain, and made his way to Berlin, where he was recruited by Goebbels. Joyce made his first broadcast in September 1939, a time when the war was still far away for most in Britain.
It just turned out that William Joyce just happened to have a gift for broadcasting. He was very articulate, very loquacious, and he had this very distinctive voice.
The great exodus from Britain is well underway. The rich and affluent are removing themselves and their valuables as fast as they can.
And Joyce's intimate knowledge of British culture and society made him an extremely effective propagandist.
He was regarded as a radio comic, a celebrity. He would talk a lot about the class system in Britain and how unfair it was. And a lot of working class people actually identified with that. That personality appealed to people, strangely enough, before the real horrors started of the Blitz.
The Blitz was a German bombing campaign which began in September 1940. As many as 43,500 civilians were killed as the German Air Force attempted to bomb Britain into submission. All the while, Lord Haw-Haw boomed across the airwaves.
The Blitzkrieg will be carried over the British Islands with greater, more appalling rapidity than over Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, or France.
Once people started to suffer, they stopped being so funny about the war when the real action started and people lost their families and they lost their homes. And then, of course, at the end of the war, when the terrible concentration camps were opened, that shed another frightful light on what had actually happened.
Lord Haw-Haw's image had soured in Britain. He was a notorious mouthpiece for Nazi propaganda and became a symbol of betrayal. As such, British authorities were determined to bring him to justice and added him to a list of wanted criminals. Joyce was arrested in May 1945 and promptly returned to England to face trial for treason. However, there was a problem for the prosecution.
And William Joyce himself, alias Lord Haw-Haw, wounded when captured and now not looking his best, perhaps in pajamas. No doubt he'll try to prove he's technically not a traitor, but the British people know the answer to that. Germany calling, Germany calling.
It turned out, once the trial got underway, that William Joyce was not a British subject, after all. He had been born in the United States. His father, Michael Joyce, had been a naturalized American, and William Joyce was himself, therefore, an American. The defense argued that since he wasn't a British subject, he couldn't have technically committed treason. Nevertheless, the prosecution, led by a very brilliant lawyer, Hartley Shawcross, said he wrapped himself in the British flag, he wrapped himself in the Union Jack, he pretended to be a British subject, and that was his value to Nazi Germany.
Regardless, debate has swirled ever since Joyce's execution at the justness of the conviction.
The notice is posted proclaiming that Joyce has been hanged. That is the only end that traitors to the country can expect.
For years later, lawyers argued whether this was if you like, a miscarriage of justice, whether it was an act of vengeance. In some ways, William Joyce was singled out because other people who had collaborated with the Germans sort of got off, not scot-free, but with a few years in prison. But I think the point about Joyce was that he was the big celebrity. Everybody had heard of Lord Haw-Haw, and for that reason, he was a particular target.
There were many thousands of individuals across Europe like William Joyce. Individuals who had betrayed their own or adopted nations, believing themselves patriots, not traitors. In Italy, as in Austria, the distinction between patriot and collaborator was complicated by its fascist past.
Collaboration in the Second World War is a very difficult concept to define in the Italian context. The first fascist movement was formed in Milan in March 1919 by Benito Mussolini. The word is an Italian word. It's the first fascist movement. It's the first fascist government in the world in 1922. And then you have 20 years of dictatorship, the first fascist dictatorship, which influences all the others.
It wasn't as though Mussolini was a novel thing in 1940 when Italy entered the war.
Vi ha convocati a Roma in questo giorno.
Perhaps 22 million Italians were members of one or other fascist organisation by the time the Second World War was underway, which is about half the population.
We're talking about a fascist state, a fascist army, and a fascist police force. So this is way beyond collaboration.
Mussolini entered the war as an Axis partner in 1940, hoping to carve out his own empire in the Mediterranean. When victory seemed assured, none of his devoted followers questioned his rule. But that grip began to slip in mid-1943.
The invasion of Sicily. This is just part of the mass of shipping ploughing across the Mediterranean. Just part of the biggest invasion armada in history.
In 1943, in just 39 days, US and British forces would take the island of Sicily and begin preparations for the invasion of Italy proper. Seeing the writing on the wall, Mussolini's ruling elite, the very people who enabled and enacted his fascist policies, deposed him.
Mussolini is arrested on the orders of the king and Italian fascism falls. And this is kind of to save the king's own skin and to try and create a possibility of a future for Italy.
Secret negotiations that are occurring in Portugal between the Italians and the Allies lead to Italy leaving the German side of the Second World War.
Determined to protect his southern flank, Hitler ordered Mussolini's rescue and installed him as the nominal ruler in the Salo Republic in northern Italy. Meanwhile, Hitler's armies occupied the south to face the Allied invasion of mainland Europe.
Italy then becomes the country which for the rest of the war is split between a southern Italy where the Allied forces are gradually moving further north and a northern Italy which is essentially under German occupation, but where Mussolini eventually will emerge to become a returned dictator, but a puppet dictator of the Nazis.
That divides the Italian people. Many still stay with Mussolini, others go to what's called the resistance, the anti-fascist resistance. They take up arms, they fight the Italian fascists, they fight alongside the Allies, they fight the Nazis.
Obviously, there are people who are fighting on the Salo Republic side who think of themselves as defending justice. Italy had entered the war on the German side, and why should they betray their ally? Wasn't that unjust? So collaborationism becomes an extraordinarily complicated story.
Italy fell into a civil war, pitting anti-fascist partisans against the fascist regime and its German backers. As the Allies liberated town after town, a familiar pattern of events took shape. Fascist collaborators were often subject to a quick and impromptu trial, sentencing, and execution.
After that moment of liberation, there's often violence against so-called collaborators. This is kind of wild violence. Thousands of people are shot, or beaten up, or humiliated. This is called the resa dei conti, the settling of accounts, which estimates say like 10 to 15,000 people are killed.
June the 4th, 1944. After months of grueling fighting, the Allies finally reach Rome and are met by jubilant crowds. But the jubilation soon turns to violence as the crowd's attention shifts to their former oppressors.
In Rome, there's massive anger amongst the population, and certain key figures are arrested, tried very quickly for collaboration, and executed. This is a more kind of controlled process.
The trial of Pietro Caruso, ex-police chief of Rome. He entered the Supreme Court on crutches, having been injured in a car crash trying to escape. Now he's on trial for his life.
In September of 1944, the first High Court trial of former police chief of Rome, Pietro Caruso, begins.
Caruso was head of the Rome prison during the occupation, gave names to the Nazis for the reprisals. He's a straightforward collaborator.
Caruso is implicated in a notorious atrocity carried out by German forces.
The German army has a standard procedure of taking hostages and shooting hostages if those who are responsible for any attack on German soldiers are not brought to justice or delivered to the German system. If you shoot one German soldier, we will kill a multiple of civilians in reprisals.
In March 1944, a partisan resistance cell killed 42 Italian police officers in a bombing as they marched through German-occupied Rome. In response, the Germans ordered the execution of 10 Italian civilians for each policeman that died. This would come to be known as the Ardeatine Caves Massacre.
The Nazis round up 335 people and execute them in caves outside Rome, shooting them through the head in one night.
Caruso had handed over 50 of those hostages murdered in the Ardeatine Massacre. Attending the trial was Donato Carretta, former warden in Rome's Regina Coeli prison.
He was actually at a trial as a witness in Rome, and people mistook him for a collaborator. They pulled him out of the courtroom. Dragged him down the street, killed him. This is a very famous, it's called the lynching of Caretta.
But this event didn't halt proceedings. Soon after, Pietro Caruso was found guilty and executed too.
He's tried very quickly by a court, taken and shot in the back as a traitor, tied to a chair.
This shows then, and it's kind of a warning sign all over Europe, you better deal with the justice, with judging heinous collaborators like this head of the prison. If not, the crowd will take care of it.
Following the trial of Pietro Caruso in 1944 and the lynching of Caretta, the Allies continued their push north, and the violent civil war between the fascists and partisans continued. The war in Italy would culminate with the capture and lynching of Mussolini himself on April 28, 1945.
Milan was in a state of the wildest excitement at about this time, for partisans had just killed Mussolini.
Mussolini was the most famous purged fascist. He was shot by partisans in 1945, hung up by his feet in Milan, in one of the most famous images of the Second World War in Piazza Loreto.
A brutal finale to a regime that had ruled through fear and repression. But now that the war was over, how did this newly liberated nation reckon with their fascist past?
Italy was emerging from 20 years of fascism and becoming an anti-fascist state. This is hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people have been fascists. Most of the institutions were run by fascists. The judiciary, the police force, the state, the administrators. They were all fascists, or at least they said they were. So what were you to do?
A High Commission for Sanctions Against Fascism was formed by the Italian government in 1944. It was set up to purge the state and institutions of fascists. Many were prosecuted, but barely anyone lost their jobs.
Most of the leading fascists get a few years in jail at most. They might get very long sentences, but they're commuted down to 5-6 years, even the really famous ones. And the amnesty of 1946, passed by a communist, Palmiro Togliatti, lets many of these people off scot-free.
The amnesty saw many ex-fascists absolved of their guilt, helping foster a collective amnesia among the Italian public over Italy's past.
A narrative is created that the fascists were actually a small minority. They're basically Mussolini and a few allies. Most Italians were either anti-fascist or they were victims of fascism. There's a kind of pact of forgetting, which allows Italy to move forward, creates a kind of consensus, but leaves a kind of darkness underneath, which is not dealt with and will never be dealt with, and leads a lot of anger.
Across the continent, other nations faced their own reckoning. Countries who, like Italy, have a complicated relationship with the notion of collaboration, where the shame of capitulation manifested in violent reprisals, and many collaborators were brutally victimized.
This historic newsreel record of the liberation of Paris begins with the approach of fighting French forces wearing American uniform. Scenes like this left no doubt whatever that the liberation of Paris, complete and final, was now only a matter of hours.
August 1944. The Allies sweep into Paris, liberating the city after 4 years of occupation. Like Rome, 2 months before, the scenes were jubilant. And just as in Italy, Paris's liberation was accompanied by violent reprisals.
As you get the last stages of the occupation, France is on the verge of a kind of civil war. And after D-Day, the Allies are now moving across France, liberating gradually the national territory. these first weeks and months is what the French historians call it the épuration sauvage, the sort of wild purges.
As seen in Italy, waves of reprisals and purges of suspected collaborators began. Approximately 10,500 executions took place during the wild purges. Denunciations, torture, summary executions, and public humiliations were motivated by the desire for revenge. But it was also driven by fear, shame, and anger.
It's in that period that you get these particularly horrific scenes of women who were alleged to have had affairs or fraternized with the Germans, having their heads shaved.
These French women were accused of collaboration horizontale, labeled as horizontal collaborators. The shaving of women's heads made them easily identifiable as so-called collaborators, and in extreme cases, they were beaten and murdered.
That was a very strong sense of vengeance against collaboration. It was a feeling of disgust at what had happened. There was shame, and there was also an element of men who felt they had been betrayed by their womenfolk, if you like.
There's something very strange going on there about men taking out almost their own sense of their wounded masculinity. They've not been able to defend their country, and their way of doing it is a sort of reassertion of masculine authority, which is directed against women. So women become the scapegoats for a sort of gender reordering, if you want, in 1945.
The haphazard reprisals of the wild purges were short-lived compared to Italy, falling in the interim between the German administration and the French provisional government. Following the liberation of Paris, the wild purge gave way to a more structured expression of justice.
General de Gaulle, who has become, as it were, the leader of the new France, arrives in Paris at the end of August 1944. And within days, de Gaulle's absolute priority is to set up a government that works and to set up proper courts to issue proper judgments. And so that period of summary justice more or less comes to an end from middle of September 1944.
As part of the épuration légale, or legal purge, approximately 350,000 collaborators' cases were investigated. However, around half of the cases were closed without indictment.
And it's interesting, the number of people actually in prison in the summer of 1945 is identical for France and for Belgium. The population of France is 5 times bigger than that of Belgium, which shows that Belgium was much more severe than France, which probably has to do with its state collaboration in France compared to Belgium.
What complicates the issue in France is that you have both an occupation but also a French government, technically legal and headed by a great war hero.
This is the Palais de Justice, where Petain, Marshal of France and hero of Verdun, is on trial for his life on charges of plotting against the internal security of his country and collaboration with the enemy.
July 1945. Arguably the highest profile collaborator trial of the Second World War commences. Each day, newspapers covered the sensational story of Marshall Philippe Petain, the World War I hero who, in 1940, in the midst of the Nazi invasion, had been made Prime Minister of France in the hopes he could galvanize the French war effort. Instead, he chose surrender and consigned France to a punishing fate.
It's vital to prove that Petain is a traitor. You can then say the people who obeyed Petain were traitors.
Petain would face 2 charges.
One is collaborating with the Germans, the other is undermining or using the defeat to destroy French democratic institutions and set up his own Vichy regime.
But Petain wasn't the only one guilty of collaborating from the previous government. When Petain signed the armistice in 1940, he was determined to maintain as much control over his nation as possible. 60% would be directly occupied by the Germans. The rest maintained a measure of sovereignty and would be governed by Petain from the city of Vichy in southern France. With the threat of further military actions hanging over his head and the belief that Germany would eventually win the war, Petain and Vichy France had to walk a tightrope. And the French Republic's government seemed to agree, ratifying the armistice Petain signed by a vote of 569 for and only 80 against.
Legally, Petain is the legitimate head of government in France. He has received the power from the pre-war parliament. The United States of America maintain an embassy with Petain's government. So for the Americans, Petain is the legitimate head of government of France.
Many of the same politicians worked in his new government. He inherited most of the government bureaucracy, judiciary, and military. Even the French public was largely supportive of this new regime at first. But Vichy collaboration was also forced in some ways.
So there was a kind of almost a devil's pact, really, which Vichy did cooperate, but in the hope of keeping some control over the situation. But the danger is that what you end up doing is what the Germans want. So let's say the question of labor. The Germans said we need French people to go and work in our factories. What does Vichy do? If Vichy says no, the Germans will presumably simply just take the people.
A complicated nuance that those accusing Petain were unable or unwilling to fully interrogate. For the trial was compromised in many ways. The senior magistrate, Paul Mongibaud, had sworn an oath of allegiance to the Vichy government in 1941.
It is literally impossible to find any judge who has not sworn an oath to Petain, because they had all sworn oaths to Petain. In the whole of the Vichy period, only one magistrate or judge refused to take the oath.
The Attorney General, André Mornay, was similarly compromised.
He had been one of the 3 vice chairmen of a commission set up by Vichy to go to denaturalize people who had got French citizenship in the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of Jewish refugees had come to France, and in that period they'd got French nationality. And the man who is the public prosecutor against Marshall Petain has sat on a commission to denaturalize Jews set up by Vichy.
The jury, too, was compromised, but for the opposite reasons as Mornay and Mongibaud.
There were 24 jurors. 12 of the jurors were pre-war parliamentarians, but they were parliamentarians who had voted against Petain in 1940. The other 12 were drawn from the resistance movements. 24 jurors are not impartial, but it would be impossible, I think, in the conditions of 1944 to find anybody who is impartial.
And the witnesses weren't much better.
The problem with them was that many of them were the former leaders of the old republic, and they were more there to defend their own reputations than to give any evidence against Petain.
Petain's defense counsel, led by Fernand Payan, argued at the trial, if Petain was guilty, so were the French. And so was France. They also claimed that he had been a shield for the French people against the worst of Nazi aggressions. But that protection did not extend to France's Jewish population.
If you had to say what are the worst things that Petain did, the one that would, to our eyes, seems the crime of crimes was the fact that his regime was complicit in the murder of 75,000 Jews.
From the outset, Petain began remodeling Vichy France into a right-wing authoritarian regime, cracking down on free speech, freedom of the press, and arresting dissenters. And it was communists and the Jewish community who received the brunt of his regime's attention.
This is also based on ideological sympathies between what the Third Reich is doing, the ideas of the New Order, its xenophobia, its anti-Semitism.
In 1942, upon the Nazis' request, the Vichy regime gave the Gestapo and French paramilitary groups free rein to round up French citizens.
By 1943, the Vichy regime has set up its own kind of sort of military police called the milice, the militia. By the end of the war, probably there were no more than sort of 50,000 people in it, but these were proper collaborators. They were hunting down resistors, they were hunting down Jews. And some of the acts of atrocities carried out by the milice were horrific. So it's very clear they are the enemy.
All told, the Vichy government deported 75,721 Jewish refugees, French Jews, and French resistance members to death camps.
And if you were doing the Petain trial today, he would be on trial for crimes against humanity. Why wasn't he? Because crimes against humanity did not yet exist as a category. It's only first introduced at the Nuremberg trial, which happens after Petain's trial.
But on the plight of French Jews, the indictment was silent, their deaths being bundled in with the many thousands of others murdered by the Vichy regime. Petain's verdict was delivered in the early hours of the morning on the 15th of August. It took 17 minutes for the judgment to be read out.
Their verdict is that he's guilty. By a margin of 1 vote, they recommended the death penalty, but they then accompanied that with an almost unanimous recommendation that the death penalty be commuted to life imprisonment.
In line with the court's wishes, de Gaulle commuted Petain's sentence to solitary confinement for life. Petain died in prison, aged 95. The trial of Petain was the most significant of the legal purges in France, but it was a flawed one. De Gaulle, reflecting on the trial, said, "Too often the discussions took on the appearance of a partisan trial, sometimes even a settling of scores, when the whole affair should have been treated only from the standpoint of national defense and independence."
The memory of the war, of Vichy, of collaboration, is a very complicated and changing one. De Gaulle believed that the trials were necessary, but he wanted to develop a kind of myth, or national story, if you want, that the French, in their massive majority, had been resistors.
For decades, de Gaulle's myth of a nation of resistors prevailed. But in actual fact, the majority, like the rest of Europe, had just tried to survive.
Most of us hope that in a conflict we would choose the right side and choose the side which is moral and good. But maybe we would be led astray. We don't know how we would react in various circumstances.
The form justice took in formerly occupied countries ranged in extremes, from violent purges to restrained legal proceedings. Sometimes it was tarnished by vengeance and hamstrung by war-weary societies.
We cannot say that post-war societies neglected the purge. The capacity of these post-war societies to organize this huge process in such a short time is truly astounding.
Meanwhile, on the international stage, a far larger and more deliberate project was taking shape. In the German city of Nuremberg, an international tribunal was busy assembling a new body of law. And the Japanese leadership had yet to face their fate. As the military tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo attempted to define international justice in the post-war world, they would face challenges of legitimacy, accusations of victors' justice, and have to navigate collapsing alliances that threatened the entire endeavor.